Just a quick note, Patty Greco has already started generating some output, and I hope, Patty, if you're here, you got my email. Please chat anything you've written. We're going to collect all the chats into a document so that the links are preserved and you can refer to interesting things you saw. Every article that got posted yesterday, I read last night, and I enjoyed them very much. So keep them coming. And as you have output, we will post it on our website. I'll get a slew of postings up this weekend. And then we'll brag about what you're writing. All right. Just one more minute and we're going to launch. Thank you so much for coming on time. It's really important because we packed so much into these sessions. We want to use every minute. So we're going to jump right in. You'll see our speakers' bios in the chat. In relation to what you're about to hear, I wanted to underscore the opportunity of our Wednesday, October 19th Caregiver Mixer, which takes place at 7 p.m. Eastern. There you're going to meet people, real people who embody the complex roles that Ai-jen Poo and Jason Resendez are going to be describing today. There'll be a lot from today's remarks that you can bring to Wednesday's Mixer session to ask these people. And everything will be on the record at that session, and our guests potentially can serve as sources for future articles. So we'll be circulating sort of recaps of their situational bios. You'll either receive that later today or possibly Monday. We don't want to swamp you with too much information, but do give a look at that that orientation sheet for our mixer on Wednesday. So, and I wanted you to have the time to prepare a little bit in advance because you'll get to choose who you're going to break out with. I think we'll either have 2 or 3 breakouts, and you'll choose based on the profiles that we furnish to you. So without further ado, I think Paula had it right in her tweet last night that we have a dream team of 3 today. I want to hand it right over to Ai-jen Poo, who more than anyone that I can think of has raised the profile of domestic care workers. There's a lot on the internet on Ai-jen, and I think you will follow up with many of her videos online. She'll be followed by Jason Resendez on family caregivers, and you'll see how by the end of this session, how their perspectives are connected like 2 sides of one coin. So I'm thrilled that Paula, Columbia's own Paula Span, will be moderating, and I pass it right over to Ai-jen to kick us off. Thank you, Ai-jen.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. It's really great to be with everyone today, and especially to be with Paula and Jason, who are 2 brilliant minds on these issues. And I think, yeah, it's just going to be a great conversation today. So I'm going to be focusing on the workforce side of the coin. And first and foremost, though, I did want to take a step back and just remind us all of something that we often forget in these conversations, which is that aging is actually living, and that longevity is really a good thing. It's aging means longer to learn and to connect and to love and teach, and it does require that we think of ourselves as an aging nation that has specific infrastructure needs in order to support quality of life as we age, and particularly care, which is the topic of today's conversation. And we essentially have not adapted any of our systems, policies, or culture to really support the incredible shift in our demographics that has occurred over the last several decades. With the boomer generation aging and people living longer, we have essentially added an entire generation onto our lifespan without actually adapting our policies to support quality of life as we live longer. And it's an average of about 20 years since our safety net was put into place. And one of the things that I think I've come across a lot in my advocacy on this issue is that a lot of people think that we have long-term care in this country, that Medicare covers long-term care or long-term supports and services. I think most of us are familiar with these terms. So I'm going to use LTSS as shorthand for long-term care. A lot of people think that Medicare covers it, and it does not, right? And what we have in the form of infrastructure is essentially overstretched family caregivers who are mostly women. And Jason will speak much more to this question. And then we also have an underpaid, overstretched direct care workforce who are majority women of color who work incredibly hard at skilled work and still struggle to make ends meet on a median income of about $21,000 per year. And a story I like to tell about this is one of our members in Georgia named Deborah really saw it as her passion, her calling in life, that God put her on this earth to take care of the older adults in her community. And she did it with such passion as a home care worker for over a decade for $8 an hour. And it became so stressful where to the point where she was struggling to put gas in her car in order to get to her clients every day, and balancing the choice between enough gas and groceries for her children, that stress was actually deteriorating her health. And so she made a really difficult decision to leave this profession for a job in manufacturing in Georgia that paid $15 an hour. And to this day is still talking to me about how she comes back. If you are extremely wealthy in this country, you can pay out of pocket for long-term care insurance, or you can pay out of pocket for the care. Otherwise, you can completely deplete your assets in order to be eligible for Medicaid, which is still to this day biased towards institution-based or nursing home care, despite the fact that more than 88% of us want to age at home. And this dynamic of having to impoverish yourself in order to have the care you need is one of the biggest drivers of inequality in America that no one talks about. And meanwhile, because of the huge and growing need for these services, the demand continues to grow. And so home health care, personal care aides, all of these categories that are associated with home care are consistently among the fastest growing occupations in our entire labor market. And because these jobs can't be outsourced or automated, we know that these are going to be a huge share of the jobs of the future. These are jobs that are here to stay. And we simply have to make them good jobs for the workers who do this work, for the family caregivers and the individuals whom they support. They must become good jobs. And by the way, just to say a note about these jobs, as job enabling jobs, home care workers enable tens of millions of family caregivers to go to work in their respective occupations throughout the labor market. So it really is the foundation of all other work. And I think we have a real generational, unique opening for change right now. For most of the last 2 decades plus that I've worked on these issues, people have told me that nothing is really going to change. When I've talked about a universal LTSS benefit, people look at me like I have 10 heads. But really, between the pandemic and the power that advocates across our silos of advocacy have come together and built behind this agenda, we have created unprecedented momentum and an unprecedented coalition that's continuing to move the work forward. And it's created this context where we now have an administration that understands the centrality of care to the economic future of the country. Not that it's a nice to have or a women's issue or an older adult issue, that this is an actual economic, at the foundation of our economic future. And it showed up at every step. So the president announced an American Jobs Plan that included a $400 billion investment in Medicaid home and community-based services with two goals. To one, address the waiting lists of people who in states are waiting for Medicaid home and community-based services, and two, to raise the wages and strengthen the workforce that provides these services. And understanding that these two goals are completely interdependent. There's no way to offer the services if there's no workforce in place to provide them. And this workforce is here to provide these services to people who are in need of them. These are interdependent goals that have been positioned as oppositional, but now everyone, for the most part, understands that they are completely interdependent and interconnected. The American Rescue Plan that passed in Congress and was signed into law included $12.7 billion for home and community-based services that has actually now become $27 billion federal dollars to Medicaid home and community-based services, because all 50 states have taken up this funding. And it's resulted in 12 states raising wages and 18 states offering temporary increases and bonuses to the workforce. So you're seeing that states, red, blue, purple, are all seeing the essential need to prioritize these investments. The Build Back Better Act that passed in the House included $150 billion in investments in Medicaid home and community-based services. And Senator Casey, who chairs the Aging Committee in the Senate, led a group of senators who were all pushing hard for these investments, from Senator King in Maine to Senator Brown in Ohio, and famously said, some of us need a bridge or a tunnel to get to work, and others of us need care, need home care, need child care. Unfortunately, this bill did not make it through the Senate, but we have made unprecedented progress and the momentum cannot be stopped. And if it had passed, if the Build Back Better Act had passed, including the $150 billion for Medicaid home and community-based services, it would have been the single largest investment in good jobs directly benefiting women and women of color in the history of the United States. And I just want to explicitly say also that the coalition that fought for this did so with the explicit understanding that it had to expand services and strengthen the workforce both. That we were no longer going to accept a zero-sum equation or this idea that it's either or, that we as the broadest coalition that has ever aligned on these issues, from providers to disability rights and justice organizations to family caregiver groups and disabled groups, veterans and labor, all of us, aging, all of us, coming out to say we need an investment in LTSS, in home and community-based services in particular, and it has to support better pay, better working conditions for workers, and more access for families and individuals. So now, coming out of this election, we'll have a better sense of what might be possible in the next round. But I just want to note the incredible historic progress that has been made. Just a few years ago, I never could have imagined that 400 billion or 150 billion would be on the table for these services, and that we'd all be championing funding being directed towards the workforce. And also, coming close is not enough. Direct care workers are now seen as essential, and it's time that we deliver on treating them that way. Thank you.
Jason, you're up.
Great.
Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Aijen. First, I have to say what a tremendous honor it is for me to share virtual stage with Aijen and Paula Spann, two fierce voices who have helped to reshape the way we talk about and act on family caregiving in this country. And as Aijen powerfully outlined, there is an urgent need to reimagine the infrastructure required to support our crumbling care system. This is essential for preserving the dignity of a rapidly growing workforce, as Aijen highlighted, and to supporting our nation's community of unpaid family caregivers. They're two sides of the same coin. They're interconnected. This community of unpaid family caregivers is my focus today. And befitting a conversation with a Zoom room full of amazing journalists, I want to start with a reflection on the words of the late Barbara Ehrenreich, who in the closing of her seminal work, Nickel and Dimed, wrote, and I'm sure this is not a spoiler for any of folks in this crowd, but she called the working poor the major philanthropists of our time. She wrote, "To be a member of the working poor is to be an anonymous donor, a nameless benefactor to everyone else. They give and they give." With these words, Barbara captured the harsh reality of being poor in America while also offering a parallel to family caregiving. Like the working poor, America's 53 million family caregivers are often unseen and undervalued. I think the same goes with the workforce, as Aijen highlighted. And like the working poor, we rely on these anonymous donors to keep our businesses open and our society running. These are the invisible philanthropists whose collective wealth, not of money, but of time and effort, we exploit to the tune of $470 billion annually. According to Caregiving in the US, research from the National Alliance for Caregiving, the organization that I lead, and our partners at AARP, we now understand in precise terms the impact of unpaid caregiving on individuals, families, and communities. These are impacts that I'm sure many of you understand well. In fact, I'd love a show of hands. How many folks on the Zoom today have provided some form of care to a loved one or chosen family before? I'm just quickly searching the gallery view. Yeah, I'm always shocked, but never surprised by the response to this question. Caregiving is a common bond that more and more Americans share. Those of you that raised your hands understand in personal terms what the data bears out. Caregiving has consequences. It's those consequences I want to explore today, along with the trends creating them and the policy change we need to address them. First, the trends based on caregiving in the US. We see unpaid caregiving becoming more and more visible in our society, with the number of self-reported caregivers increasing by 10 million between 2015 and 2020, reaching 53 million. Compared to 2015, a greater proportion of caregivers of adults are providing care to multiple people, with 24% caring for 2 or more care recipients, up from 18% in 2015. In addition to providing care to more people, Americans are also navigating more complex care situations. Compared to 2015, caregivers are more likely to report their adult care recipients needs care because of long-term physical conditions, emotional or mental health issues, and Alzheimer's or another dementia. So not only are Americans taking on the role of unpaid caregiver, but they are doing so for recipients with increasingly complex medical or support needs. This care isn't easy. 4 in 10 caregivers are in high intensity care situations, which means they are providing approximately 50 hours of care per week, juggling multiple activities of daily living and complex medical tasks, changing catheters 1 minute and then assisting with bathing or feeding the next. More often than not, these folks receive little to no training to provide this essential support. As a result, the share of family caregivers who report difficulty in coordinating their care recipients' needs has increased from 19% in 2015 to 26% in 2020. 1 in 3 family caregivers is providing care completely alone with no help from anyone else. 1 in 3 have other unpaid caregivers helping out, but no paid help. With this backdrop, it shouldn't be surprising that more than half of all family caregivers feel that they have no choice in taking on this role. And across the board, the majority, about 62% of family caregivers, report they need more training and information to carry out their roles. 1 in 4 say it's very difficult to get affordable care services in their community, like delivered meals, transportation, or in-home health services that would help them provide better care. This increased prevalence of care, increased complexity of care, and lack of training and supports creates health and economic consequences for family caregivers. From a healthcare perspective, we know caregivers are forgoing their own health and emotional needs to provide care. 23% of family caregivers report that caregiving has made their health worse. More than 40% of family caregivers have 2 or more chronic diseases themselves, and 23% of them find it difficult to take care of their own health. Of those family caregivers who report difficulty in taking care of their own health, 60% report that caregiving has made their health worse. These are acute issues for caregivers of color, with Black caregivers less likely to report being in excellent or very good health compared to non-Hispanic white caregivers, and Latino caregivers more likely to report experiencing a moderate to high intensity level of physical strain due to caregiving. I remember a conversation with a caregiver just this week who told me that working out was her way to relieve stress. But after her father's heart attack and her mom's dementia diagnosis, she was lucky if she could get out once a day to grab the mail. She gained weight and developed high blood pressure and high cholesterol and was put on 2 medications to treat those complications. The mental health consequences are just as stark, with nearly 4 in 10 caregivers reporting that their care situation is highly stressful. Feelings of isolation and loneliness are also common and have been exacerbated by the pandemic in ways that we don't fully understand. I'll say it again, care has consequences. They come in the form of poorer health outcomes for caregivers, and they come in the form of economic instability. Take my friend Daisy as an example. Daisy's dream was to open a Chicago Cubs themed sports bar in Springfield, Missouri, the middle of Cardinal City. And she did so and aptly named it the Cubby Hole. She loved jeering with all the Cardinals fans and being part of the community. It was a little after a year of owning the bar that she noticed behavior changes in her mom, Sonia. She was more aggressive, she had mood swings, and eventually she started to see people that weren't there. Daisy was enlisted by the inaction of her siblings to help her mom. She looked to her primary care physician with no avail. They said it was stress, so she pushed and pushed until she was able to meet with the neurologist, who told her that it was a rare neurological condition called Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease that would progress rapidly, and she was given 6 months to live. Daisy was devastated and scrambled to figure out her care, ultimately closing the bar so she could be Sonia's primary caregiver. But Daisy's an advocate, as most caregivers are, and in seeking the best care for her mom, Daisy learned that her mother was misdiagnosed, as Latinos with cognitive health issues often tend to be. She actually had early onset Alzheimer's disease and not CJD, but the damage was done and her dream was forever changed. Her mom would need more and more care as the disease progressed. And over the 15 years that Sonia lived with Alzheimer's disease, Daisy worked a series of low-wage hourly jobs while her mom was in adult day services or with another family member, including her teenage nephew. She worked as a waitress, she worked as a designated driver at a country club, and everything in between, all while balancing the care that her mom needed. Daisy's mom died a little over a year ago, and she said that her caregiving role was one of the most profound, meaningful, and draining experiences of her life. Her story brings to life the data we have on the economic impacts of family caregiving on individuals, and especially women of color. Of our nation's 53 million family caregivers, 61% are women. Within communities of color, 66% of Black, 61% of Latino, and 58% of Asian American primary caregivers are women. Like Daisy, most family caregivers provide care while employed, about 61%, often struggling to meet both the obligations of care and work. The pandemic compounded these issues, with the forced closures of adult day services and other home and community-based supports being stretched to the brink. As a result, Black and Latina caregivers were forced to leave work. According to the Bipartisan Policy Center, 16% of Latinos and 13% of Black Americans left the workforce during the pandemic because of caregiving responsibilities for an adult loved one. That number goes up dramatically when you include parental care as a driver for leaving work. Daisy was one of those workers. More broadly, caregiving tends to intensify economic inequities and create economic instability. 1 in 5 family caregivers report high financial strain, with higher percentages among people of color and members of marginalized communities like LGBTQ Americans reporting financial strain. In addition, almost half of caregivers have experienced at least one negative financial impact as a result of caregiving, such as taking on debt, unpaid or late bills, or having to borrow money from a friend or family member. Not surprisingly, the less money you earn, the more severe the impact are. Income earners under $50,000 report the most negative financial impacts as a result of caregiving, particularly among Black, Latino, and LGBTQ caregivers. I'm brought back to Ehrenreich's exploration of the American poor and wonder about the intersection of the workers she highlighted, nickel and dimed, and their caregiving responsibilities. It's this intersection that makes family caregiving an urgent labor issue and an urgent economic security issue, as Ai-jen outlined. Again, caregiving has consequences. But despite these consequences, there's a resilience that comes through in the data. Positive emotions often coexist with feelings of isolation, stress, and strain. Half of all family caregivers report that their role as a caregiver gives them a sense of purpose and meaning in life. Latino, 61%, and Black, 59%, caregivers are more likely to report that caregiving provides them with a sense of purpose compared to white caregivers, about 46%. This brings me back to the vision that Ai-jen outlined and the policy change needed to stop our exploitation of caregiver resiliencies. Policies that recognize and reward the selfless act of care and make it economically and emotionally sustainable. As Ai-jen outlined, we need to ensure that the direct care workforce is well paid and well trained to provide the quality care that millions among us need today and that we will need tomorrow. But we also must think about ways to ease the strain on the care system by ensuring that unpaid family caregivers can perform their role without robbing their own health and wealth. One of those policies is paid family and medical leave. It's our view that paid leave, while not the silver bullet, can help family caregivers across the lifespan and across income levels better balance the responsibilities of care and work. Paid leave can simultaneously advance economic, gender, and racial justice for family caregivers while ensuring they have the time they need to navigate the complex health and care challenges their loved ones and they themselves face. We need stronger home and community-based supports that enable Americans with disabilities or other functional differences to receive the services they need in their home and communities rather than in institutional and congregate settings. And we need economic policies tailored to family caregivers that recognize the tremendous value they bring to our society. Policies like caregiver tax credits and Social Security credits that can lessen the financial strain in the short term and long term that caregiving creates, especially among women of color. And for the first time, we have a national family caregiving strategy released just 2 weeks ago by Secretary Becerra that weaves these policies together into a framework that we can point to and hold policymakers and federal agencies accountable for. The RAISE strategy outlines 350 federal actions and 150 private sector and community actions that we must take to support unpaid family caregivers and the army of direct care workers that support them and us. By doing so, we can reverse course and start investing in the resilience of family caregivers instead of selfishly exploiting these nameless benefactors. It won't be easy, as Ai-jen highlighted with the work around Build Back Better, but we are in an amazing moment and opportunity to make a difference for family caregivers today and for family caregivers in the future, including most, if not all of us. And it won't be easy. But as my civil rights hero Dolores Huerta once told me, we have the power, the people power to make anything happen. And I deeply believe in that. And the power of the people on this screen and people like Ai-jen and Paula and everyone else give me hope that we can create this reality together. Thank you.
That is a wonderful summation of a series of vexing problems that have been looked at from every direction, and sometimes we just want to throw up our hands and say it's too complicated, we can't fix it. And sometimes we also think that this is an antagonistic relationship. If you lift up workers, you cost families. If you help families, you keep wages low. And we are trying to find a way for that not to be true. So I wanted to ask Jason and I-Jen to talk about some of the sometimes smaller scale, sometimes not so small scale attempts at solutions that have been tried here and there, and how they play into this dual-sided issue. So I think one of the big ones is organized labor. And we are seeing SEIU, Service Employees International Union, organizing direct care workers, especially home care aides in, what is that? In California, in Massachusetts, I think in Illinois. How does that work with some of the other solutions, these federal actions and so forth that we've been talking about?
Jason, I can kick us off.
Yeah, definitely.
So, you know, the role that unions have played in this sector has been pretty important, pretty foundational in terms of putting these jobs on a pathway to becoming good jobs. The average pay of a union worker versus a non-union worker is about 11.2% higher. There's more access to healthcare, training. There's more access to paid sick days, which has been a huge issue. 82% of non-union care workers don't have a single paid sick day. And so it has been proven that unionized workers have better jobs, better job quality, better job conditions, and are also more prepared to do this work because of access to training and resources. And Washington State is actually quite a good example of how the unions have played a role in transforming the ecosystem of supports for long-term supports and services in the home and community. The union created a training program called the Washington State Home Care Training Fund that is the second largest educational institution in the state of Washington after the University of Washington.
Wow.
They train about 40,000 home care workers per year in 12 different languages. So they're building a cultural competency around these services in the state that is really important, increasingly so as we are such a diverse nation. And they have ongoing continuing education, specializations in terms of training, and the starting salary for a home care worker in Washington State who is a part of the union is $17 per hour. And they have healthcare, they have retirement benefits. And then the union helped to advocate for the country's first long-term care benefit in the country. There is a new benefit that is universally accessible to people in Washington State that helps cover the cost of long-term supports and services. So it's a holistic, the way the union is approaching it is people need to be able to afford these services. We shouldn't have to also impoverish people in order to get the services. And the services, the quality of jobs and quality of care are completely interdependent. So when we invest in the workforce, both are better. And so that's an example of the difference a union makes, not just in the lives of the worker themselves, but in the lives of the people they support and the state's capacity and infrastructure that Jason so beautifully articulated that is going to be needed for us.
Jason, do you want to
Yeah,
add
and I would
anything?
I agree with everything that Ai-jen outlined. I'd come back to something I said in my overview, the fact that over half of unpaid family caregivers are employed while providing care. So a huge population of family caregivers are a part of the labor force. And so thinking about the importance of organized labor in creating economic stability, improving health access and the quality of healthcare options for workers is interlinked with the health and wellness and wealth of family caregivers. And I think we have to do more to look at that intersection and how we conceptualize these issues and develop policy that recognizes those intersections.
Jason, you mentioned things like tax credits and Social Security credits for family caregivers so that they don't lose traction in their own financial stability by being family caregivers. What do you think about some of these programs? I think they're still small and scattered, in which family caregivers can be paid. They can be the paid caregivers for their family members. It has obvious benefits. It gives them an income. It means they know their care recipient very well. They speak their language literally and figuratively. They know what food they like to eat. They're trusted. But there are some consequences in terms of their future Social Security earnings. How do you see that evolving?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need a menu of options. I mean, I think one of the issues that's so challenging when you're working on caregiving is that care across a lifespan is so complex and comes in so many forms that it's really hard to find a policy that's going to be a silver bullet. So it's really about the menu of policies that can support a diverse caregiving needs across a lifespan. So I think programs like consumer-directed care, which is what I think you're talking about, where family members can get compensated for providing care, is a really important option. And we see that as being one area that needs to be optimized to support unpaid family caregivers across conditions and across lifespans. There's so many, but we've heard from caregivers who said, yes, I qualify for this program in my state. It's primarily paid through Medicaid, which, as we know, is 50 different programs. I qualify for this program in my state, but I can't afford the 2 background checks that it takes in order to get into the program. Right. So these barriers that exist to even accessing existing programs that we need to optimize with the goal of easing the strain on the system, incorporating more family caregivers into those options, while also looking at other things where that might not be the best option for someone who needs maybe more complex care. I think about my sister in Texas actually benefited from consumer-directed care for my grandmother, but it was mainly running errands and sort of helping with really light mobility issues. She needed more complex care. It wouldn't have been the best option. So we have to think about, again, how we tailor and have a number of policies that can support family caregivers across a lifespan, across conditions.
Right. Ai-jen, do you think that most direct care workers would be accepting of this as an option for care recipients to hire their family members?
I do, absolutely. In California, for example, professional care workers and family members who become professional care workers through the IHSS program all are in the same union, are in the same, see themselves as part of one caregiving force in the state. And I think it makes perfect sense. And honestly, most direct care workers are family caregivers for their own family members as well, and really identify with that experience.
Yeah. And if I just add on one last thing, we actually asked that question in caregiving in the US. And what we find is, particularly among Black and Latino caregivers, they say they would love to be paid for the care that they provide, in addition to other policies like tax credits, et cetera, that help to address out-of-pocket costs associated with family caregiving that right now are completely fall on the shoulders of the family caregiver.
One of the barriers to this solving this issue, I think, for home care specifically, which is where most people want to stay, right, is the middlemen, the agencies that a lot of people use to hire home care workers, take a very big chunk of what is paid either by government or self-paid out of pocket, and by taking the chunk that keeps wages lower for the workers and makes costs higher for the consumers, But there is all, and so that's what results in the gray market, which has its benefits and also its shortcomings. But there have been some attempts to try to bypass that. And one that I admit, fellow journalists, I committed the primary journalistic sin of writing about this 10 years ago and not checking back to see what happened to it. But there are states, including Oregon, that have state registries, and they do the vetting, the background checks. And through these registries, families and individuals can directly hire vetted caregivers. And so the families pay less, the caregivers get more. I don't know what's happening with that. I don't know if it's scalable. Do you have any opinions on it? Ai-jen, do you want to go first?
Yes, there are a number of registries in states, and I do think it's scalable, and I'm a proponent of them. I'm essentially a proponent of addressing the fact that this caregiving landscape is just a wild west. And you're just out there in the wilderness trying to figure this out. And what registries do is they enable you. They are a resource where workers and consumers and families can find each other. And if you are somebody with a very particular need, which most of us are, like if I needed a Mandarin speaking caregiver for my grandmother, the registry actually facilitates me finding that person. And the difference that can make for a family is a game changer, especially for working family caregivers. So I'm a proponent of things that help us in the wilderness and create resources that actually streamline and facilitate people finding the care that they need. And that's what these registries do. And they often also provide other training and other kinds of resources that are beneficial to both families and workers. So I'm a big proponent.
Jason, do you feel like most family caregivers, even in these states where registries exist, and there are something like, there were 16 when I last looked at this, do they know that they exist? Is this something that just needs more attention?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I think everything that exists for geared towards caregivers needs more attention. We see that in our data, where folks are just, again, it's the Wild West. You don't know where to turn, because when you're in this situation, you're living the day-to-day reality of needing to provide this care. So really ease of access and ease of use of resources becomes really vital. And so really thinking about, again, just needing to have several solutions, like those solutions that are state-based registries, but then also entrepreneurial-based solutions, which there's an incentive in investing in awareness, and the market is growing. And so I think it's a mix. I think we have to have a way of having conversations about accessibility, about how issues like quality of care and wage issues are addressed. So all of the above. I mean, I think it's something that we need more of, both private sector solutions and also state-based and federal supported solutions in terms of registries and resource repositories.
Okay. We want to open this up and let the fellows ask questions of our panelists or volunteer information that might be useful for others. Would you raise your hand and I will call on you if you have a question for Ai-jen or Jason?
Paula, I think we have a lot of hands.
Like I am,
You see
oh, I
them?
see. Yes, okay. Liza Berger, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. I actually am an editor for a business publication called McKnight's Home Care that's geared to home care agency owners and operators. So this is right my bread and butter, what you're talking about right now. So what I'm interested in pursuing most likely is the intersection of home care agencies and family caregivers. So I guess I just like to expand upon what you've talked about, or would like you to expand upon what you've talked about, and see how interested is home care then in working with personal and family caregivers, and what are the opportunities now for them to train and to provide some more connection with the people who are taking care of their clients. It's a big topic, but I'm just wondering if you could touch on that.
Jason, can you?
Yeah, sure. I would
respond?
say, I mean, I think from my perspective, it's a completely underdeveloped area, right? I mean, I think that's why I love the way that we have that Caitlin has constructed this conversation, like looking at the relationship between the direct care worker and the unpaid family caregiver, right? It's that relationship that hasn't been properly invested in terms of what is the training, what are the policies that we need to support that relationship, and what the outcomes for the patient, for the caregiver, for the direct care worker are when you start to optimize that relationship and those pathways. So I think one, absolutely, we need more attention. I mean, we'd love for agencies to better conceptualize how to support unpaid family caregivers. I think unpaid family caregivers, we know they need support, they need training, and looking at that as an opportunity for providing that kind of upskilling around unpaid family care is a tremendous opportunity that I have not seen any models, particularly scalable models. I think there are issues related to reimbursement. So as we think about the policy change that we need, how are community-based providers incentivized to provide that kind of training? And as we think about modifications to and the need for the kinds of investments that Ai-jen outlined, I mean, that should be kind of one of those areas of potential innovation.
Can I just add that I really want us to think about the role of the family caregiver and the direct care worker also is just a part of at Caring Across Generations. We talk about very intentionally building care squads, that family care is actually a all hands on deck situation, right? There's that old adage of it takes a village, and it really does. And I think the more intention and investment we can put in the relationships that are about care and these services, the better the outcomes are going to be. So if the family caregiver and the direct care worker and the whole healthcare team are all working together and communicating, it's just all the better for everyone. And so just to really invest in those relationships and seeing us all as a part of a whole caregiving project, each playing very particular and important roles that are equally of value, I think is just really important.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment, I was thinking about this, the same profile of the personal caregiver is the profile of the home care worker. It's a woman of color. So it's it's like the same, almost the same work, it's the same demographic. It's the same people.
Care squads is a great phrase. Nina Keck, you had a question.
I did. Thanks. I'm really enjoying this discussion. I am a public radio reporter in Vermont, and I cover aging. And I'm curious about, you've talked about how professional caregivers have been kind of marginalized. And I'm wondering, in other countries that have centralized medicine, is there a whole different view of the profession of caregivers? And are they seen differently?
Ai-jen, I think this is for you.
Yes, thanks, Paula. Well, I will say a couple of things. One is that the particular history of racism and anti-Black racism and its association with domestic care work in particular in this country is a unique history that has created a pattern of legal and policy exclusions that have really defined the experience of this workforce in unique ways, and not just affecting Black women who do this work, but everybody. And so that is particular, but I will say that globally, this workforce isn't treated and valued equally to other forms of work, and that oftentimes across the board, it's women of marginalized social status who do this work, migrant women, women of color, women from rural parts of the country, that it is devalued in such a way that people who are marginalized are tracked into it. And so that is true. And I would just love for this country to actually, we're oftentimes, especially when it comes to care, the last sort of the bottom of the barrel. I mean, we're one of a tiny number of developed nations that doesn't have any paid family and medical leave mandate. so embarrassing. But I think that we could be leapfrogging forward on this issue and actually be a global leader in making this workforce a highly respected professional workforce of the future. And I think we could lead the way on that front. And certainly countries that have universal long-term care programs have put more attention towards the professional development of this workforce, but I still don't think anybody really has gotten it right.
Okay. Bill Cole, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. This is a question for Jason and Ai-jen. An issue that's come up in our earlier plenaries is sort of like the nexus of immigration and caregiving. I work in and grew up in Massachusetts, where Haitian Americans occupy a home healthcare niche. Beautiful people, beautiful care that they're providing. I say Haitian Americans. I can't even say that necessarily. Some are naturalized. Some may even be undocumented, for all I know. I guess my question is, given the thorny immigration landscape in the United States and in other countries, is that problematic? Because immigrants certainly seem to be, a big part of the caregiving landscape.
They absolutely are. I think it's hugely problematic. There is actually no way to meet the demand for care in this country without a strong immigrant workforce and the contributions that immigrants are making to this work. And so I believe that there should be a path to citizenship for the immigrant workforce, so that they can enter into this profession and into the light, out of the shadows. I mean, a lot of immigrants who do this work are working in the shadows and frankly creating a really big challenge for improving job quality for the workforce overall. And so, yeah, I think it's a win-win to allow for immigrants to legalize and be authorized to work in this sector. And it's something my organization is working on as we speak.
Jason, what do you hear from families about this issue?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down again to we need to do anything and everything we can to ease the strain on the system. That means creating better and more direct care workforce jobs. It means improving a family's ability to provide care in the home and lessen the health and economic consequences of that care. And I think that immigration is one of the many policies that we need to look at as a lever for easing the impact on that system, and particularly with an eye towards meeting the needs of unpaid family caregivers. As we think about demographic shifts in unpaid family care, a lot of those are cultural, right? So as we think about how do we meet that supply with cultural competent care, immigration needs to be part of the solutions that we look at. It doesn't make it easy. It makes it, like all of this, really difficult. But I think that's the reality that we have to get comfortable with.
All right. Jeanette Liardi, and then we're getting towards our stop time here.
Thank you. This is so informative. I really enjoyed this panel. Thank you. I'm a gerontologist who writes and teaches on aging issues, and I have also been a family caregiver for a long time in the past. I'm concerned about. I'd like to know what you think that for both of you. This is a question for both of you. What do you think are the challenges that face formal and informal caregivers who interact with each other? You spoke about the relationship, but are there specific issues regarding expectations they have of each other and their performance in their task? Have you come across some specific ways in which formal and informal caregivers may have differing ideas about the level of care, the quality of care? That's for both of you.
Jason.
Oh, yeah. So I think it's an area where we need more attention in terms of better rigorously understanding that relationship. And I completely agree with Ai-jen. We have to invest in that concept of a care squad. And part of that investment needs to be understanding what those expectations are, what are the ways to best facilitate and optimize that relationship based on outcomes and shared expectations. So I think it's an area, an area of the Wild West when it comes to caregiving research, which caregiving research in and of itself is an area that needs to be, more robustly invested in. But I think anecdotally, we've heard a lot about sort of mixed expectations. And I think this plays into, and I'll let Ai-jen expand on it more, how caregivers sometimes are exploited by the fact that these are low-wage jobs, that some of them are potentially undocumented, right? Sort of those expectations are different. And, looking at care as a job that's not about indentured servitude, but is about providing quality care to a loved one to help both the worker and the care recipient have a dignified life. I mean, I think that's really the question that we need to work on.
Ai-jen, I think you get the last word.
Ooh, that's a lot of pressure. Yes. So what I would say is this, that that because we have so invested in care, whether they're family caregivers or professional caregivers, it is very much a Wild West. And we have left too much up to the individual, to the point where people are in the wilderness on their own, but also to the point where it's very hard for there to be standards and norms that actually support the dignity and well-being of everyone involved, which is the goal. And so that's, I think, the challenge of this time, is to set a culture of care in our country that recognizes and supports everyone's contributions and dignity to the process.
Okay.
Uh,
I'm sorry to have to let some of these questions go unrecognized and unanswered, but Caitlin, I think it's back to you.
Thank you so much. This was an incredible discussion. Lots of questions left. I encourage all the fellows who have remaining questions to pop them in the chat. I had a question I'd love to hear answered at another time about disruption in this field by Jason mentioned entrepreneurialism, but another area where it's ripe for disruption, but also ripe for abuse and more middlemen who exploit this population. So absent policies that work and disruptions that work, we're not at all through this battle. The battle is just beginning. So thank you all so much. We're going to break. It's 55. You have a 5-minute chance to connect with people in the coffee room breakouts, or jump up, get a bite to eat or a glass of water, and come back right at 12 noon Eastern. And we're going to start again with another amazing panel. Ai-jen, Jason, and Paula, thank you. That was really wonderful.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Caitlin.
Yep.
Kathy here. Can you remind me, how can I sign up for the interviews? Because I know I can't stay on after the call, and I'm sorry, I'm getting things.
Kathy, we'll be sending an email out right at the end of this program that will have the link for you.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. I was worried that I needed to do it now, and
No, but
yeah,
we
if you could do it promptly at 1 when we send it, that would be great.
I will
and-
try. We have our fund drive, and I have to go on right at 10 or 1.
Okay.
So we'll do my best.
Okay,
So-
great. And
To
if
everyone-
you have any problems, you can contact me.
Thank you. I appreciate
Any
that.
other fellows on this who are listening, we expect you to stay on the call just for a minute at 1 p.m. Eastern. We have 2 tasks for you that are very important, and we need your feedback. So Kathy has a conflict. You will also receive it by email, but please plan to complete it by just minutes after 1 o'clock so we can get going on our end. We'll see you back here in just 3 minutes or so. All right, we're going to start up in just 1 minute. Nell, if you could prompt me when the rooms are cleared, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. 20 more seconds.
Thank you.
And we're all set.
Great, thank you. I don't want to waste any time because this panel is chocked full. I just wanted to remind you again at 1 o'clock when we break, please stay here for 5 minutes to complete your selections for your Ask Me Anything interviews and to complete our evaluation. And with that, I want to pass it immediately over to a really great member of our team and a former fellow, but also an advisor throughout and a friend. Carol Heimowitz, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. As we've been hearing, a large share of the growing demand for elder care is being met informally by relatives. About 41 million family caregivers, 1 in 5 Americans, provided an estimated 34 billion hours of unpaid care to an adult who needed daily assistance in 2017, according to an AARP report. The estimated economic value of their unpaid contributions was about 470 billion. You heard some of this from Jason. Our panelists are going to drill down into this now. Robert Espinoza, Yulia Treskanovsky, and Jennifer Wolf will discuss the consequences of this for informal caregivers themselves, for paid caregivers, for employers, the healthcare industry, and the overall economy. Yulia, can you start us off and tell us how family caregiving disrupts work? How often family caregivers leave work or retire early, hurting their own financial well-being and retirement security?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you to Caitlin and the organizers for having me on this panel. So as we saw in the previous session, a lot of us have taken on caregiving roles, and certainly anybody who's done this knows that care and work can often be incompatible. And so I'm an academic economist, and in my research, I focus specifically on the employment trajectories of people who take on these caregiving roles. So thinking about how quickly they stop working and do they ever return to work after taking on caregiving. And what I found in my research is that once people become caregivers, they often leave the labor force very quickly in the first year or so, and they don't often return. So this doesn't, of course, mean that everybody who becomes a caregiver leaves the labor force. So we see employment drop by about 5%. So, that's something like 5 out of 100 caregivers. But for those who do end up leaving, it's a total exit. We don't see them start winding down, switch to part-time, switch to unemployment, and kind of gradually weave their way out of the labor force. We see them stop working immediately, which means they stop earning immediately. So they lose out on those immediate earnings, but they also lose out on opportunities to build earnings, through promotions, through other kind of tenure opportunities, and that's the opportunity to secure financial stability for the future. In work that others have done, they found that caregivers are more likely to retire early. This is particularly a big deal for women who are the majority of caregivers, because for them, earnings and labor force participation peak in their mid to late 50s. So when they take on these caregiving roles is exactly when they hit peak earnings to kind of set them up for their financial future. Then the cost, which all of this means that the cost of taking on caregiving in terms of these trajectories can be much higher than we think, because they're not only immediate, but they last for a long time. I want to also highlight that as an economist, I think about caregiving as an economic decision. So people take on caregiving roles because they are facing a particular set of incentives or constraints. So maybe they've lost a job or they've recently retired. There are no other available affordable options such as paid care, which, as we've talked about, is a key part of this whole equation. And so the relationship between caregiving and work is complicated. I found that some people take on caregiving following a job loss or a job separation. The cost of their time suddenly becomes much lower. But if you start caregiving once you've lost a job, you're not looking for a new job. You're not looking to return to the labor market. You're not engaging with your skills. And that also has long-term costs. And finally, I just want to end by saying that, we don't think of caregiving necessarily as a burden, but it's important to understand as a society, both the individual and the broader costs and trade-offs that are implicit when we rely on a largely unpaid family-based long-term care infrastructure.
Thank you, Julia. Jennifer, can you talk about the disruptions that occur for those who keep working, both in terms of absenteeism and lesser productivity, some of what you've researched?
Sure, I'm really delighted to be here today. I've been working in the field for many years, and in the context of what seems like remarkably slow and incremental progress, I have to say I'm encouraged that there's so many of you here who are interested in learning about and reporting on family caregiving. I'm a health services researcher, and a lot of my work has focused on the intersection of family caregivers within health and other care delivery settings. And I'm looking forward to talking more about that later in the panel. But with respect to what we know about caregiving and employment, it is true that it is the Wild West, that family caregivers are largely invisible in organizational systems of care. And because they're not, caregivers are not paid, their time is really difficult to understand, track, and value. And there is no sort of systematic flagging of family caregiver status or circumstances by employers or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so we really have a patchwork understanding of how caregiving and work are interconnected. I have the privilege of being highly involved in the National Institute on Aging funded National Health and Aging Trends study, which is a unique survey platform that involves a population-based sample of older adults, as well, and also surveys up to 5 family and other unpaid caregivers who are helping them. And in the National Study of Caregiving, we ask about caregivers' employment status. We ask about types of employment as well as impacts of caregiving. And we differentiate absenteeism from work due to caregiving, as opposed to absenteeism for one's own health issue or because of taking vacation or helping with childcare. And we also ask about presenteeism, which refers to lost time from work due to being distracted or disengaged while being physically present on the job. And this is really the first national survey to disaggregate work productivity loss due to caregiving in this way. And in a recent paper that is included in your readings that was led by Dr. Mani Keita through her dissertation, we found that nearly 1 in 4, or 23% of working caregivers to older adults experienced either absenteeism or presenteeism just over the last month due to caregiving responsibilities. This translated to more than 2 million caregivers. We found that about 13% of caregivers experienced absenteeism due to caregiving, about 14% experienced presenteeism due to caregiving, but there was very little overlap between the two, indicating that these are very different constructs. It's not surprising. But we found, importantly, that the magnitude of lost time due to presenteeism was 3.5 times that of absenteeism. And in fact, in the occupational field, absenteeism has been called the tip of the iceberg because it is more visible, but relatively small in magnitude in comparison to lost time while being physically present. We found that caregiving led to about 8% of lost work time among all working caregivers, And caregiving work productivity loss was about 34% of lost work time among those caregivers who experienced any work productivity loss due to caregiving. And Dr. Keita translated these findings across all caregivers and estimated the average cost of lost compensation to employers because of caregiving related absenteeism and presenteeism was about $5,600 annually for caregivers who experience these outcomes. And it was overwhelmingly due to absenteeism. And importantly, looking at correlates, we found presenteeism was far more common among caregivers who were better educated and those who are helping older adults with more severe disability. But that help from family and friends was protective of experiencing this outcome. And importantly, I know there was some interest in gender-related differences. We found absenteeism was more common among working family caregivers and those helping older adults with greater disability. And this is really consistent with what we know about the gendered nature of caring and work, where it may be more acceptable for women to take on this role in a more visible way. Overall, our study is important in that it looks at more short-term proximal impacts of caregiving that may be relevant to employers in understanding the importance of really understanding opportunities for and making the case that this is an important issue that is worth investing in. And also, I think it's important in highlighting what we know, which is that caregiving is so heterogeneous and nuanced. And so there's a lot of opportunity for all of you to really, do a deep dive and, consider the impacts. Caregiving is not just one thing. It really, there's a lot of variability across individuals and working groups. And
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. Robert, I wonder if you can talk about how the situation for paid caregivers, their low status, their low pay dovetails with the family caregiving force, how those two forces intersect.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Carol, and thank you everyone for this conversation today. I think I would start by underscoring what Ai-jen and Jason shared in a previous panel, which is that family caregivers and direct care workers are really two sides of the same coin, and the role that direct care workers play and can play in the lives of family caregivers is that they offer support for caring for a loved one, and they also offer respite because family caregiving can be emotionally taxing. It can also involve quite a bit of physical labor, and it has a financial cost as well. Yet what we also know is that oftentimes they're the same person. So many direct care workers are also family caregivers, and because of what are called consumer direction programs, in many states, if not all states actually, a family caregiver can be compensated for the care that they're providing a loved one, though obviously that program needs more funding and more expansion. The points that I would make, because direct care workers are central to the health and the financial well-being of family caregivers, is that also depends. So much of the work that needs to happen is about improving the quality of jobs for direct care workers. And just for definitional purposes, we define direct care workers as workers who support older adults and people with disabilities in a variety of long-term care settings. They work in private homes, they work in nursing homes, and they work in residential care settings like assisted living. There are about 4.7 million direct care workers, and already they are larger than any other occupation in this country. Yet what our research shows is that this workforce struggles. It struggles financially, and it struggles to meet the needs of family caregivers and of employers, of agencies. One of the reasons is, of course, inadequate compensation. Direct care workers make a median wage at this point of around $15 an hour. And yet, because many of them are relegated to part-time, part-time work or irregular hours, about 40% live in or near poverty. That's crushing for workers. It also pushes them out of this field, often into other industries like retail or fast food, which means that consumers or family caregivers struggle to find workers that just for basic jobs. Another challenge is that these workers often aren't trained enough. So training requirements in the direct care workforce, they vary by state, they vary by setting, and they vary by occupation. So as a family caregiver, if you hire a worker, you cannot be assured that they necessarily have been trained and equipped with the right skills or knowledge to succeed in their roles. And because turnover rate is so high, often between 60 to 90%, and often within the first 90 days, the continuity of care that many family caregivers and that many of us who need care want and deserve is simply not there. The point I'll make, just my final point, is that I do think that there are solutions for each of them as segments, solutions for family caregivers and solutions for direct care workers. And yet, perhaps the most promise are solutions that address both. And here I would point two things quickly. One is that in the earlier panel, they spoke about the importance of caregiver registries or matching service registries. These are online platforms where a consumer who's hiring a worker themselves individually can find a worker and vice versa, and they can find one based on their preferences, needs, and availability. However, those registries don't exist in most states. They're often underfunded, and they're not great technologically in most states. And so really expanding the number of those registries across 50 states can be something that both public and private sector leaders can take on. The final point I'll make is that we don't know enough about what it means to strengthen the relationship between family caregivers and direct care workers. What are the kinds of interventions that we can implement at the healthcare level? How can government officials support? And what is the research and the analysis that's needed for us to understand that dyad of a family caregiver and a direct care worker? I think that's a critical issue.
Thank you, Robert. Yulia, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the differences between male and female family caregivers and employment and some of the opportunity costs there.
Sure. Yeah. So I think often when we talk about family caregivers, we're thinking about women. But the reality is that about 40% of family caregivers are men. And it's true that that men and women who are caregivers take on slightly different roles. So if you look at surveys, but the other big difference that I've found is that their employment trajectories look very, very different. So I talked about caregivers exiting the labor force very quickly once they become caregivers. That's primarily true for women. I've found that male caregivers tend to experience employment disruptions before they become caregivers. And that circles back to this notion that caregiving is like an economic decision for some people. So there are forces, be they economic or job related, health related, that propel some individuals to take on this caregiving role. And who takes on this caregiving role might be determined by the economic or job circumstances that they face. So we found that men often take on caregiving roles after they've lost a job or after they've experienced a disruption in their work. And caregiving seems to kind of dovetail with these other shocks to continue to pull these people, certain people, away from the labor market. And to kind of circle back to the point that Robert made, that these are two sides of the same coin. I think that you can imagine a situation where there is an availability of alternatives, including a robust direct care workforce, where an individual can actually make a decision, right, about the kind of care that they or their loved one might need. That allows them to maybe maintain labor force attachment, even if they've experienced kind of volatility previously, where they can continue to sort of look for a job, remain on the job market while, having that support there.
Okay, thank you. Robert and Jennifer, maybe you can talk a little bit about the inequities in this entire system. You have the low paid direct workforce doing this caregiving. You have family caregivers who haven't had enough money to hire home health care, their own paid workers, so they're forfeiting their jobs and their retirement security. You have a two-tier system here. What is your thinking about that, Robert?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a system that's deeply inequitable and rooted in just a long history of devaluing workers, especially women and women of color. I think some of the main challenges that we see among this workforce, I mean, one is economic. Jobs usually don't pay enough or offer enough hours. And so many workers take on multiple jobs and remain in poverty. They enter direct care in poverty, they remain in poverty, and they leave direct care in poverty. And so it's a system that really kind of depletes them financially, and it affects their own retirement savings. I think it's a workforce that isn't properly valued. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they were deemed essential in public policy, but in reality, their jobs are not valued as essential. They're not paid enough. There are few advancement opportunities, so it's not really a career. And when we think about the full care team, the care squad that Ai-jen mentioned earlier, when you look at formal systems, you often think of doctors, of nurses, sometimes social workers, but you don't always think they're direct care workers, and they're not included oftentimes in what are called the interdisciplinary care teams. Like family caregivers, they're not seen as critical supports and recognized as such, even though together family caregivers and direct care workers are the front line of support. I think that those are some of the main inequities that they face.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to add to that?
Just to chime in, I agree entirely with all of his comments. Just we know that I agree about the comment about family caregivers and other direct care workers really being the boots on the ground and you know, heavily involved on a day-to-day basis with people with more extensive care needs and having the least preparation and training, as well as the least sort of I guess respect in terms of being able to sort of officially interact with healthcare professionals in the context of care delivery. You know, in our work, we found nationally that less than 1 in 10 family caregivers report receiving any training, and we know the same is really true on the direct care workforce side too. That people they're being thrown into very complex roles without adequate training, support, and career opportunity. Thank you.
You know, given the very tight labor market, despite the likely potential forthcoming recession, shouldn't employers be concerned about the fact that they're losing so many employees to family caregiving? What's needed to keep family caregivers in the workforce? Why aren't they concerned? Does anyone want to start that? Jennifer?
Well, I can take this on as a starting place. I'm sure that Yulia and Robert can chime in. So I think there's a challenge because we don't have great information. I think that there's a lot of concern. Employers are a little bit flying blind and worrying about opening up Pandora's box. And so I think that, you know, this is an area where we really need good data to be able to inform not only employers in terms of what to expect, as well as having a better understanding of what works. And I know, you know, that this is what this whole panel is about, but and this, you know, this whole session, which I think is really important. So having strong, you know, moving out of convenience samples to national information that's generalizable, to help employers understand the magnitude of the problem, the costs that are involved with support programs, as well as what benefit can be derived, I think is really important in overcoming some of these issues.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in and reiterate Jen's point about, you know, the data limitations. I think one big thing in terms of studying this question from an employer perspective is how do employers and how do we as researchers identify caregivers in data? You know, so with you know, we deal with this with childcare. You know, how do employers support people, you know, workers who have children? And with childcare, it's very easy to you go from not having a baby to having a baby. There's a discrete change. It's very clear. When you become a caregiver, it's for an adult, it can be a slow process, right? It can be a discrete change, but it can be a slow process. And, you know, you start with some, some things here and there, some chores, and then suddenly you find yourself a few years later taking on, increasingly more time. And so how do we kind of pinpoint who is a caregiver from an employer's perspective? How do employers decide, which benefits are available and how to allocate those benefits? And at what point do you qualify for benefits, I think is a much trickier question. And that should be part, I think, of the discussion, as well as, who do we identify as caregivers? How do we think about that from an individual perspective, from a health system perspective, but also from, a employer's perspective?
Thank you. Robert?
Yes, if I can speak to the direct care side, we certainly see employers gravely concerned about what they consider a workforce shortage in direct care and the challenges that have become even harder in terms of recruiting and retaining enough workers. It's often at the top of their conference proceedings, and most surveys of long-term care employers' workforce challenges are the #1 concern. And when we look at research in terms of growing demand for direct care workers, we estimate that between 2019 and 2029, the long-term care sector will need to fill about 7.4 million job openings in direct care. Now, many of those are new jobs that are being created to meet demand, but a lot of them are because workers are leaving for other industries like retail or fast food. I think the solution is threefold. One is the best way to recruit and retain a direct care worker that can support a family caregiver is by creating a good job. And there are frameworks for that. PHI has one that has 29 strategies. It's about supervision, it's about compensation, it's about training, and so much more. The second is that there are certainly recruitment methods that need to be explored in the sector for employers. Tapping into underrepresented populations in this workforce. Men, for example, only make up 14% of the direct care workforce, or older adults who are, nearing retirement age, but might look for a career shift is another example. And then third, as a benefits question, many direct care workers don't have access to good benefits. And in most research, they say it's their primary interest. And so what are all those benefits? It's health coverage, it's paid family medical leave, right? It's access to transportation, to food and nutrition supports, and so much more. And the best way we've seen it in the field, if you're not offering those benefits directly as an employer, it's by forming relationships with community-based organizations that can then offer those supports as additional benefits to workers.
Thank you. Let's pivot a second to the healthcare industry, which actually might be benefiting from all these unpaid family caregivers. Jennifer, do you want to talk about that?
I am so delighted to talk all about that. So it is absolutely true that, we have a broken care delivery system. It's fragmented, it's siloed, it's challenging for those of us with full capacity to navigate. And if you are someone who's living with serious illness, if you have cognitive impairment, if you have sensory deficits, you for sure need a family member to be involved in helping successfully navigate the system. And so family caregivers really are responsible for bridging and sort of fulfilling the gaps. And they do so in a way with a significant impediment, in that they are not formally recognized. There is no sort of place for people to include who their family members are in their electronic records. And so the care delivery system for sure is benefiting in all kinds of ways. We know from a variety of studies that people who have family members who are involved and whose family caregivers are more competent, in terms of feeling confident that they have the capacity to navigate the system, they do better. They have better health outcomes. They are less likely to experience sort of potentially adverse consequences related to care. They tend to use services less intensively. So it is absolutely true that the care delivery system benefits in all kinds of ways. And we are very much at the beginning of developing systems and strategies to systematically identify and support caregivers. This is really important, though. It was flagged as one of the main recommendations in the 2016 Families Caring for an Aging America report issued by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. It is very heavily present in the national strategy to support family caregivers. And there are a lot of promising steps, most of which have not yet really been fully implemented in a way that has led to concrete benefits, but where the conditions of participation around Medicare home hospital discharge and home health care, they call for education and support of family caregivers. They just are not, those conditions of participation are not being yet met in a way that's meaningful. And I think another area is around consumer health information technology, which has been widespread. So across the country, there's increasing use of the patient portal, and patients can access their information in a timely way. And most electronic medical record vendors have the capacity to allow patients to identify a proxy or share their account with a family member or friend. And this is a way that people can identify who they want to be involved in their care and let that family caregiver interact with the care delivery system in a way that's legitimate and where they have their own credentials and where they are able to access timely and comprehensive information about the patient, and the care team, the formal clinicians are able to identify who that patient has involved in their care, wants to involve in their care. So this is really, I think, one way that doesn't impose additional demands on the care delivery system, that recognizes that many patients, especially those with more significant needs, want to include family caregivers, and it's not just one, multiple in their care. So I'll stop talking. I could go on and on.
Thank you. I'm curious about the cost savings here and whether some of that could be passed back to the caregivers for training, for better wages, for direct care, for helping family caregivers who are losing their own wages. Robert and Yulia, do you want to talk to that point?
Sure. Yeah, I can highlight that. I think that in terms of the savings, there's when we have a system that relies primarily on unpaid or very, very, very low paid caregivers, it's not just the healthcare systems, it's Medicaid, because Medicaid is the #1 payer of long-term care, and we save Medicaid a lot. Well, we save ourselves because we are the ones who fund Medicaid, right? But we are saving a lot of money every year by relying primarily on families and very low wage direct care workers. And it's also in terms of other direct social safety net programs. We see those costs when the direct care workers or family members are relying on public benefits because they aren't compensated and they're not able to work otherwise. So I think that there's a big balancing act that's happening. I think it's very hard to put a dollar amount, but certainly when you think about overall, the different the different piles of support here that exist, I think it becomes clear that there's some restructuring that could happen. And I think Ai-jen's point in the previous, or in her opening, that we have a social safety net, including Medicaid and Medicare, that really isn't equipped, wasn't designed with this particular kind of population in mind, with these needs, with these shocks, with these risks. And so I think that certainly, when we're talking about the costs and we're talking about, it's hard to put a direct number on it, but you can start to imagine how a rebalancing could take place and needs to take place.
Okay, Robert?
Yeah, if I can step in, I think, oftentimes what the work that PHI does and that I do is with government officials who are interested in policies and fixes that can really strengthen direct care jobs and the relationship between workers and caregivers. And yet these interventions have a cost to it. They have a fixed cost to implement, a strong training program, an increase in wages, et cetera. And many officials will balk at that. They'll say, this is, it's too expensive. Our budgets are already strained, especially through Medicaid. And yet what we need to recognize is that good jobs can actually lead to cost savings. We have demonstration projects, for example, in advanced roles that show that when you train and support a home care worker in an advanced role to better communicate changes in a client condition and work with the family member, you actually reduce costly hospitalizations and ER visits as one example. If you improve jobs, you also increase consumer spending, you reduce public assistance spending, and so on. And yet too often, I think in this country, we think about the price tag at the onset and not the long-term benefit, not to mention all the other reasons we should be creating good jobs. And so I think that's important as we think about this equation.
Thank you. I want to drill down even more in this number we keep hearing, $470 billion. That's huge. Given that number, what are some of the solutions that we should be thinking about that would improve the situation for caregivers, whether they're paid or unpaid, and elderly people who need care? What are some of the solutions? You want to start, Julia?
Sure. I mean, I think there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is, we can work on the margins. We can try to think about policies on the margins. I think something like paid family leave would certainly be a great first step. Paid sick leave, universal paid sick leave, to help family caregivers who may need to kind of take time out of the labor force because of some reason to help family members, as well as direct care workers who would benefit from that as well. We can think about programs that might compensate family caregivers. I think that from a perspective of incentives, we have to think very carefully about when we incentivize family members to be caregivers, what are they giving up? So I think there's complicated set of questions there. I think there's Robert mentioned a number of interventions from the direct care workforce side. I think those are all marginal. We have some evidence that some of them work, some of them don't. We can think about an employer intervention. I personally, from where I sit, which is, admittedly in academia, and it's not a very kind of, I don't have a direct responsibility. I like to think about maybe a fundamental rethinking of how we organize, the landscape. Can we think about a system where we have long-term care insurance that actually that's a market that actually works, and where everybody actually has this benefit? Maybe we expand Medicaid so that everybody can afford home health, LTSS, in the way that they choose, whether that be with family members, whether that be through a professional caregiver. Can we prioritize? Can we uplift the direct care workforce in a way that is sustainable, where we're not losing half of the workforce to other jobs every year? But I think that again is just to reiterate what I said earlier, kind of a more than just the sum, that's more than just the sum of several individual policies, which I do think on the margin can go a long way. So I'm not sure where I have the freedom to kind of imagine a world, but I think if you're on the practical side of things, I think then the marginal interventions are going to be the way to go.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to offer one solution or something?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that Julia said. I think that because of the heterogeneity in caregiving and the fact that it sort of touches on so many different facets of life, it's really not one thing. And I am really excited about the national strategy to try to think of more cohesively about caregiving. I guess one thing I would say is that I think having government programs that are coherent, where we are really trying to reach the people most in need, seems incredibly important. Sort of recognizing that many caregivers who are really doing extensive, very like caring for some of the most people with the most significant needs may not identify as a caregiver and may not feel like they can take time away to go to a support group. So I think really being thoughtful about how to try to address inequities seems incredibly important. And that's why, in part, I think this national strategy is so important.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. I would absolutely echo the idea of a social insurance program in long-term care. I actually think it is quite practical, and we have one in Washington State. I should say Washington State has one, where we're learning a lot about, the intricacies of what it means to create and adopt one. I would argue that it should be a national social insurance program in long-term care that would help people cover those costly services and not pay out of pocket or reduce their income and assets to qualify for Medicaid. And it should be designed in such a way that it also improves jobs for direct care workers and addresses kind of the emotional and financial challenges of family caregivers. Workers, when you ask them what they want better wages, they want good supervision, learning and training, advancement opportunities, and so on. And I would say, especially germane to this conversation, we need a new narrative on direct care and family caregivers, one that speaks to the points we've made in the previous panel about their critical roles and yet their devaluation as caregivers in this country. And one that, and for workers especially, one that doesn't think of direct care as unskilled or low-skilled work, which it is definitely not, because I think we need one that ultimately professionalizes this workforce and sees it as just as valuable as any other healthcare professional.
Thank you very much. We have a little more time. I want to open this up to questions because we had so many questions in the last panel that weren't answered, and I'm sure some of these panelists might be able to answer them. So I'd like to give people time to ask questions here. I also want to urge everyone to listen to Yulia's video because it has some great statistics in there and about breaking down what a family caregiver is actually worth and not being paid for. Anyway, questions? Kathy.
Hey there, thank you. So I just want to preface this by saying that I come at this as someone who helped support my mother's caregiving journey. And that was a very long time ago. And then as somebody who tried to organize and help connect the dots in the Phoenix area with another former caregiver after our loved ones died, we started a community group, and now as a reporter. So I've been in this space for a really, really long time, both personally and professionally. And I think my question really is like, I've heard I've talked to Robert, I've interviewed him numerous times, and he's always gracious with his time. And I'm like, I need something now. But we're always talking about these solutions, right? Like the care, like how do we enhance the direct care workforce? We've known that there's not been a deep bench even before COVID. That's not new. The idea of having like, a long-term care or national long-term care program, like all of these ideas are out there. And yet I don't see anything really, maybe at the local level, sometimes there's smaller grassroots. When I interview people, they're still running into the same challenges that I ran into in 2008 or 7 or whenever my mother first started to change and become sick with her dementia. And I'm not seeing a lot of progress. And I guess my question is, as somebody who interviews people now, like I've talked to the National Consumer Voice and they have excellent ideas. I've talked to ACA and their Arizona chapter, and they'll tell me, well, it's a Medicaid reimbursement issue. Like we're not getting reimbursed enough, so we can't raise wages. And people are going to Costco because they're making $20 an hour and getting health insurance or whatever Walmart is now offering. which is probably more than I make now. At the end of the day, there is still inaction. And as a reporter, I'm like, who do I talk to? Because I hear from, what we need to do. And then I hear from the long-term care facility saying, we can't do it. We're not getting paid enough. And National Consumer Voices told me that, like, at the end of the day, you're talking about CEOs in the more private, like, companies, not like the leading age nursing homes or more not for profit. They're making lots of money. And so at this point, I run into these barriers of, like, nothing is changing. And I, as a reporter, I get frustrated because I want to give people solutions, but it's one thing to speculate and theorize about what would be optimal when at the end of the day, in real life, that's not happening. So I guess my question is, in thinking about stories, like, I run into brick walls sometimes of, like, well, it's Medicare's fault or Medicaid's fault, and we're not getting paid enough. And, are they going to reimburse? What's the incentive for them to train people up if then they have to pay them more and they don't want to pay them now?
Well, I'm going to throw that question to Robert.
A big question.
And I mean, I also dovetail back to what Ai-jen said, where she talked about there have been improvements. Robert, do you want to talk to Kathy's question?
Sure,
It's
and I'll do it
broad.
quickly because I know Jennifer looks like wants to answer it as well.
Yeah.
Just really quickly, I share that frustration. I share it both professionally and personally in my own caregiving journey. I will say that I think while there isn't enough action, there is action happening, and it often is at the state level. And so we've been working with a variety of states that are actually doing quite impressive things. I just met with the Department of Health in Wisconsin last week to talk through a certified professional program that's creating a universal role for direct care workers, career ladders, et cetera, right? And so it's going to take time for us to see the benefits of it. I just think it varies by state and it varies by locality. And I would 100% agree that it's not enough.
Okay, Jennifer, do you want to weigh in here?
Sure. Yeah. And I agree that a lot is happening locally and that I think that an area where there's been profound change has been through shifts in financing and payment, where we're seeing, an explosion in Medicare Advantage. And I think those health plans are very interested in anything that they can do to improve care and lower costs, and supporting family caregivers is one of those, but they are proprietary. So we don't know very much about what it is exactly that they are doing. There also has been an explosion in managed long-term services and supports. And again, that's at the state level. And again, it's proprietary, so we don't know exactly what's happening. But I think that this is an area that really is ripe for investigation. And I think it would be wonderful to begin to really understand how companies are approaching these issues, and there is a lot of action sort of at the intersection of the payment models as well as technology.
Thank you. Betsy, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carol. Robert started to answer this or talk about it. So maybe he or others could expand on it. I'm just interested in what some of the more interesting things are that are happening at the local level. Maybe if each of you had one or two that you might point us to.
Anyone want to talk? My panelists, Jennifer, Julia, go ahead.
I can hop in. I think so. One thing that is national, but for a select group of people is the VA has been doing some very, I think, interesting things in terms of compensating family caregivers, incorporating family caregivers into healthcare systems. I think there's been some really interesting work coming out of that healthcare system to try to kind of dig into some of these questions. So that might be another place to look. I agree with Jen also that like what Medicaid is doing with trying to shift more and more people out of institutional contexts and into home-based contexts, I think is an area where we're going to see a lot of kind of potential potential for improvement. I say that, hesitating a little bit because we don't really know what happens when we move a lot of people out of nursing homes and into a community-based care. Are there going to be enough caregivers? Are we pulling family caregivers in? But that's certainly another place to be looking. And then also, yes, Washington, Robert absolutely highlighted that Washington State is doing some has very interesting policy experiments going on.
Thanks. Anyone want to add to that quickly, or should we move on to the next question? Getting a lot of questions here. Lila.
Hi, thank you so much. I kind of have two questions, but we can stick with one. It's just, I'm wondering, with the recession that people are talking about looming, what can we expect? I know that it sounds like family caregiving, or more people become family caregivers during a market downturn. And what is the impact on the direct care force and workforce? And what do you want employers to know about that?
Yulia, do you want to start that one? Because I know you've looked at that.
Sure. Yeah. So I found that during economic downturns, recessions, more people become family caregivers, presumably in part because they are losing, losing their primary kind of the thing that they do all day, and so they have additional time. So a slight kind of wrinkle to that is that we also see some people demand more in-home care, because when a primary care, during recessions, we also see kind of older adults, for example, lose financial security because their investment portfolios, their retirement portfolios are falling. And so you have something called the added worker effect, where a secondary person might need to go to work. And so we found actually that among older families, in particular where spouses were providing care, that spouse might need to actually go to work, opening up the need for professional caregiver. So, we both see more family caregiving during recessions, but also greater demand for professional caregivers from some populations. But I know Robert could probably speak more to
Really
that
interesting.
end.
Thank you.
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, I'll just say that echoing Yulia's point, I mean, if the demand for direct care workers increases, but the number of jobs that are available for that candidate pool decreases, then we can imagine it might be easier for employers to recruit and retain direct care workers. That said, I don't know anyone who's modeled it economically or in other ways. No.
Thank you. Ronnie, you have a question. If you're there. Not sure.
I am here. I'm just curious as I watch things over time. I mean, when I was growing up, it was a matter of course that generation stayed together, and the next generation took care of their parents and their family. And now it's become like such an issue and such a concern. And I'm wondering how things can get implemented. There was a mention made of changes in the Medicare Advantage, possibly changes there. How does some of this get incorporated so that home health care becomes part of the norm, so that we don't have to discuss it in the way that we're discussing it now? It's just routine. And I know that's a big question, and I would like to talk to all of you.
It's a big question. Anyone want to answer? It's a very big question. So
I was just going to say that,
go ahead.
So it's so actually there have not been that many studies that have examined trends in caregiving over time. It's very difficult to study because caregiving shifts in concert with demographics, and we are currently at sort of the beginning stage of the baby boom. But our group did look at trends over about 20-year period and found there was no evidence to suggest decreasing caregiver availability. In fact, there was, looking at the aging of the baby boomers into the early stages, there were more available caregivers helping a less impaired population. Now that will dramatically change as the baby boomers age. But we found overall that, there was no evidence to support this urban myth that families are not caring for loved ones. And in fact, we found there were some shifts towards more working caregivers, sort of setting up the importance of this conversation, as well as more male caregivers. So I'm not sure that only answered part of her question.
Thank you, Jennifer. We're going to be running out of time any minute here. So is there one quick thing, Julia, you want to add, or Robert, before we close?
If I can add one quick thing, which is that in my experience on this issue over the last 7 years or so, when a reporter or when a policymaker or when a industry leader finally becomes interested in direct care workforce and long-term care issues, it's because someone they know needs long-term care, and they begin personally exploring the system and realizing how dysfunctional and fraught with problems it is, right? It reminds me, I came out of the LGBT rights movement. It reminds me about the importance of coming out as a political strategy, right? And so I think it is in many ways a cultural strategy that journalists can play a role in, which is elevating kind of the stories of workers, of family caregivers, and all the different ways in which this system in many ways is broken. Because I think the more and more, because you shouldn't have to wait until you're in crisis to realize the system that shrouds you.
Thank you very much. And it's been great talking to all my panelists. I really appreciate all your knowledge. And I know there are more questions, but there'll probably be time for you to ask them later. I'm going to pass this back to Caitlin.
Wow, thank you so much. That was an incredible tour de force panel, unpacking so much, and its complexity is obvious to everyone. Thank you, all of you, and Carol, thank you for your excellent moderation. I'm sorry we didn't get to a couple of the questions. We'll continue to try to catch up. Please put them in the chat if you can. This is going to remain a frustration, but when you ask your questions, if you can stay concise, it will help us gain some time at the end. So I want to launch quickly into a few things before I hand it over to Nell, because I know you're all very interested in how you'll select your one-on-one interviews with these amazing people who are making a lot of their time available for your one-on-one interviews. But first, I wanted to make a special acknowledgement of the RRF Foundation for Aging, formerly known as the Retirement Research Foundation. I think Serena Worthington may be in the room. I wanted to thank her expressly because she helped me think through this project at the very beginning, and her colleagues. Unfortunately, one of them is retired, Nancy Zweibel, who was amazing in the preparation of this. So many, many thanks to RRF. So I just wanted to say, I hope you are all thinking about story ideas. I come away with like almost a hopeless head full of facts and data. It's really complex. We're going to get to the policy piece, which is, another level of complexity. And so your job is really hard. And I hope you'll spend a little time between now and your interviews about thinking about kind of drilling into that complexity and finding ways to simplify it for your readers, or at least make it more accessible. Remember that all of the recordings of all of the sessions so far will be made available to you on Monday morning. I will also spend some time now with Nell walking us through how you select your one-on-one interviews. But you want to prepare for those for sure. And we will do the matching over the weekend, and you'll be advised on Monday who your interviewee will be and what time, and we'll also advise our speakers as to who they'll be sitting with in those express one-on-ones. So the last thing I want to say is, in the chat, you're going to see 2 links, one for the Ask Me Anything interview selection, and one for the evaluation of these first days, including our mixers. I would appreciate very much 100% participation in that evaluation. We actually read them. This